In the early hours of January 3rd, a swarm of US military aircraft quietly crossed the southern Caribbean into Venezuela. For the next 2 hours, lights across Caracas went dark, and air defenses were systematically taken offline. By sunrise, Venezuela had woken up without a president. Nicolás Maduro, the man who'd ruled here for 13 years, was gone, seized overnight and flown out to face charges in a Manhattan federal court. But Washington didn't present this as a blunt act of regime change. Instead, it was framed as law enforcement, a counter-narcotics campaign rooted in logic the US has used before. Remove a hostile leader not as a sitting head of state, but by redefining them as a threat. That was how Washington was able to indict Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega in 1989, and again in 2003 with the capture of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Before the raid, the Trump administration accused Maduro of heading up Cartel de los Soles, a criminal drug-running network allegedly embedded within Venezuela's military and political elites. According to Washington, Cartel de los Soles had facilitated the flow of cocaine shipments across Venezuela, working through infamous domestic gangs such as Tren de Aragua and then through established transnational cartels such as Sinaloa in Mexico, with their cocaine and fentanyl running operations into the United States. In this telling, Maduro wasn't just complicit, he was the problem. It laid the groundwork for Trump to indict him and Cartel de los Soles on charges of narco-terrorism. This accusation was sweeping. That Venezuela's leadership had turned the country into a transit hub for cocaine bound for the United States. But there's one big problem with this, and that's scale. Venezuela is not a major producer of cocaine, nor a significant source of the synthetic opioids driving America's overdose crisis. Most fentanyl now entering the United States originates in Mexico with precursors from China, not Venezuela. And while cocaine does transit through Venezuelan territory, 99% of production is centered across neighboring Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. There's little to no evidence that Maduro's government was ever directly orchestrating or exporting these flows on a scale implied by Trump's rhetoric. That gap between the official narrative and the actual evidence matters. Evidently, Maduro's capture was never really about narcotics or cartels, it was about authority. The 21st century invocation of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, and who gets to enforce the rules in America's backyard. Still, even that explanation has its limits. Yes, America is the Western Hemisphere's military hegemon, that much is undeniable. But Venezuela should not have been this exposed. A state with more proven reserves of oil than any other country on Earth should not be forced to bend the knee to a foreign power, let alone be humiliated in such a way. Venezuela should be the one making the rules, not finding itself at the mercy of them. So how did we end up here? Our story starts in 1922. An oil well named Barroso II blows out near the Venezuelan town of La Rosa. This event alone releases the equivalent of 100,000 barrels of crude oil per day, with a plume that could be seen for miles. In the decades that followed, oil transformed the country's economy so completely that by the turn of the 1970s, Venezuela had the highest GDP per capita in Latin America. But abundance has a way of hiding its costs. Venezuelan crude is heavy, rich in impurities like sulfur, and difficult to refine. Extracting value from it requires far more than just drilling. It demands specialized refineries, advanced processors, and a level of capital investment that few countries can sustain alone. That reality shaped who Venezuela traded with, who financed its industry, and ultimately who held leverage over it. Foreign oil companies including ExxonMobil, Shell, ConocoPhillips, and Chevron were brought in through joint ventures with Venezuela's state-owned oil and gas company, PDVSA. Meanwhile, a dense network of refineries was built along the US Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, specifically to process Venezuelan crude. By the late 1990s, an overwhelming 2/3 of the country's oil exports were heading to the United States alone. For many years, that system worked remarkably well, but it also led to a phenomenon called Dutch disease. Oil no longer dominated just the Venezuelan economy, it came to dominate the state itself. The huge inflow of foreign currency from oil exports gave way to runaway corruption and mismanagement. Between 1972 and 1997, as much as $100 billion was simply embezzled into the pockets of corrupt government officials. Meanwhile, oil production came to represent about 90% of Venezuela's exports, 70% of government revenue, and close to 40% of the country's GDP. That sort of economy works brilliantly, but only when oil prices remain high. When they fall, everything else tends to fall with them, and Venezuela was about to learn that the hard way. Overproduction and falling global demand throughout the 1980s created a glut of oil in the market. Then, in 1985, Saudi Arabia abandoned its efforts to prop up prices and instead increased its output to regain lost market share. The result was a flood. prices of crude oil worldwide contracted from around $30 per barrel in 1985 to just $10 per barrel the following year. The system that held OPEC together for decades had suddenly broken down, and with it, so did the Venezuelan economy. Revenues dried up, debt ballooned to unforeseen levels, and inflation spiraled out of control. Then, in 1989, Caracas was forced to turn to the IMF for a financial bailout that involved harsh austerity measures. Subsidies were cut, the Venezuelan bolivar was devalued, and taxes and interest rates were raised across the board. The backlash was immediate. After decades of corruption, billions of dollars siphoned off through PDVSA, and now IMF-mandated austerity that was imposed on ordinary people, public trust finally came to an end. That frustration expressed itself as a wave of deadly riots across Venezuela, an event now known as the Caracazo. Though it only lasted 6 days, the Caracazo was a turning point in Venezuela's history. It destroyed what little legitimacy the state still had, and that created conditions for far more radical ideas to set in. The vacuum left behind was tested 3 years later in 1992, when a revolutionary named Hugo Chávez attempted to launch a coup d'état against the government. The coup failed. Chávez found himself imprisoned, but later emerged victorious in Venezuela's 1998 presidential elections, with promises of redistributing the country's oil wealth to reduce poverty and inequality. And so began the socialist experiment in Venezuela that has lasted for almost 3 decades since. For a time, it looked as though Chávez had found a way forward. China's own industrial revolution in East Asia had given it an insatiable appetite for raw materials, and crucially for Venezuela, oil. The resulting commodities boom sent prices of Venezuelan crude rocketing from around $20 a barrel at the turn of the century to more than $120 a barrel by mid-2008. That huge inflow of capital gave Caracas the means to reinvest heavily in social programs. Poverty fell, as did inequality, and millions of Venezuelans experienced real improvements in their quality of life. But for all the short-term gains, few understood just how much Chávez was borrowing from Venezuela's future. When strikes hit the state oil company in 2002, Chávez responded not with negotiations, but by clearing house. Roughly 18,000 of PDVSA's most experienced engineers, managers and technicians were sacked and replaced with political loyalists. The expertise that had taken decades to build was suddenly dismantled, as was the country's ability to maintain and expand production. At the same time, Chávez pursued a policy of nationalizing the oil industry in Venezuela by forcing foreign oil firms into joint ventures under majority PDVSA control. Those who refused the new terms, that being Exxon and ConocoPhillips, had their assets seized outright. Unsurprisingly, relations with Washington fell apart, and foreign investors quickly began to withdraw from Venezuela. If that wasn't enough, Chávez also began supplying heavily subsidized Venezuelan oil to fellow left-wing governments in Cuba and Nicaragua, which drained what was left of any strategic reserves. It was an unsustainable system, but so long as oil prices remained high, that very system remained popular, and Chávez used that popularity to rewrite the rules. Presidential term limits were removed, independent media outlets were harassed or even shut down, and the power of his executive office was expanded to near dictatorial levels. When Chávez died in office in 2013, the system he built was inherited by his chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, who took the opportunity to consolidate his government into a full-blown dictatorship. Within a year of Maduro taking office, the global price of oil plunged from over $100 a barrel to around $30 a barrel by early 2016. But Venezuela still hadn't learnt its lesson, and it was about to learn it for a second time. The bolivar collapsed, inflation became hyperinflation, and the Chávez-era subsidies and social welfare policies that made him popular with the people suddenly became unaffordable. Once again, unrest turned into protests. Jobs vanished, and food, medicine, electricity, even gasoline became scarce. But rather than reform, Maduro chose to respond with tyranny. Dissidents were jailed, elections were disputed, and opposition figures were barred from running. All of this led to a mass exodus of Venezuelans throughout the Americas. Its diaspora now numbers as many as 8 million people, making it one of the largest migration crises in Latin American history. But as is often the case, when a regime doesn't bend from within, it invites pressure from abroad. Over in Washington, patience was wearing thin. Targeted sanctions against Maduro began under Obama, but under Trump they evolved into a different beast. Access to the US financial system was cut off, making it near impossible for the country to borrow money and service debt. American companies were prohibited from buying Venezuelan oil, and firms involved with shipping it elsewhere were also sanctioned. The result was that Caracas could no longer access the Gulf Coast refineries it had relied on for decades to process its oil. But the sanctions also blocked spare parts and chemicals from entering Venezuelan ports, which choked off the country's ability to keep its own industry running. Between 2014 and 2021, the economy of Venezuela contracted by almost 3/4 as oil production collapsed to levels not seen since World War II. That is one of the worst peacetime economic collapses witnessed in recent memory. But for all the damage done, the sanctions failed to achieve their real purpose. Yes, Washington had made a pariah out of Venezuela, but Maduro did not fall, and the regime lived to see another day. And after having been shut out from Western markets, Venezuela didn't choose to isolate itself. It simply looked elsewhere. Russian bombers began landing on Venezuelan airstrips. Iranian arms and energy supplies started flowing from Tehran to Caracas in defiance of American sanctions. Cuban intelligence expanded its footprint to assist Maduro, and Beijing emerged as the primary consumer for discounted Venezuelan crude. So, in trying to squeeze Maduro out, the United States inadvertently pushed Venezuela deeper into the orbit of its rivals. This is exactly the kind of scenario that the Monroe Doctrine was designed to prevent. Of course, none of these relationships actually solved Venezuela's problems, they just helped the regime survive. With all this in mind, the events of January 3rd and the capture of Nicolás Maduro no longer seem sudden. In 1922, Barroso II announced Venezuela's oil wealth to the world. What followed was a century-long wager that oil alone could sustain a state. Whether that wager is truly over or simply entering a new phase remains to be seen. But Venezuela's collapse was not down to oil alone, nor to sanctions alone. It was the result of power concentrated without restraint. Hugo Chávez made waves in Venezuela, and Maduro inherited them. By the time global oil prices turned and external pressure mounted, the institutions that could have corrected course had already been dismantled. A country built entirely on a single commodity, a political establishment concentrated in the hands of autocrats, and an economy that never learned to function during oil downturns. When each of these falters simultaneously, nothing is left to catch the fall. And until this changes, the future of Venezuela will continue to look much like the past. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.